I'd stumble down hills all the time if I didn't give myself grace every day. Trust me. How you doing?
I'm doing okay. Um, so we were going to talk a little bit about some American history, and you kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the mine wars, correct? And the red
Mm-hmm.
bandanas and the phrase redneck and just all that encompassing for a moment, right?
Yeah. Yes, I did. I would love to. I'd love to
Um,
because I know a tiny bit about the word and the history of it and whatnot. Um, and just poor folks in general and whatnot. Um, and I know every time I look up anything about rednecks, especially even with me trying to study up a tiny bit before this live stream, this is going to be learning a lot. I don't expect to say too much. It's going to be me learning a lot, but every time I look up anything that has the word redneck in it, I get a whole bunch of stereotypes, a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't have anything to do with the history of the word redneck or any of the movements or whatnot. It's just a bunch of mess. So I'd love to hear about the history of it and talk about that.
yeah, because today when we hear the phrase, um, we have a completely different meaning. The meaning is kind of morphed in a weird way, and this happens with the definitions of a lot of words through time, very obviously.
Right. Yeah.
A lot of times, and especially in the United States, you find that that happens with phrases that surround radical movements too. They get sanitized and kind of dumbed down a little bit by the time, as history passes. And redneck would be one of those phrases. And the word redneck itself, you do see it in the American vernacular, but not on a consistent basis. Really, as to refer to like old farmers and stuff like that, like way back in the day, like our 1800s, maybe even 1700s. As far as America is concerned, right?
Mm.
Um, you start hearing it, kind of like in that context. And this lasted up until after the Civil War. In that context, it kind of meant um, you were poor, you were ignorant, you were a little backwards, maybe. And you had mentioned before in a conversation before about like Scotch Irish rednecks.
Yeah.
And so sorry, it's the mailman.
There they go.
It's very dramatic when we get mail.
Yeah. Hello from Ohio.
So yeah, it kind of meant when you talk about Scotch Irish, a lot of the settlers that were in the Appalachian region were Scots Irish. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And there were specifically, groups of Scots Irish that were extremely Protestant and anti-Catholic, and a lot of those groups were sometimes referred to as redneck also during that time period, right?
Hmm.
um, but for the most part, when we talk about the mine wars, and when people are using that phrase in conjunction to that specific region when it comes to West Virginia, and you hear people, invoke the mine wars when they're using that phrase. Fairly consistently, I see it on this app even.
Yeah.
Um, then you're talking about something very, very specific. And, you're talking about radical miners from, the time of the mine wars. So you were talking about 1912 through like 1921 was Blair Mountain, but it was like a slow drum roll of violence going up until 1921.
Hmm.
Um, with the peak being Blair Mountain. So, the word itself eventually turned into this, like, you know, again, back to the backwards, rural, ignorant kind of thing. And then Jeff Foxworthy and folks like that picked it up. Right. Well, it
Yeah.
gave kind of gave it this new like identity then, because now I'm a redneck and you said it proudly then. It kind of forced
Hmm.
this weird conversion to it. Like it was at the 90s or so that happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And it kind of changed the entire way that we kind of looked at that word and used that word in the American vernacular. He really did that. He really, really did that. Um,
Yeah. It was especially where I grew up. Jeff Foxworthy, that whole bunch that he traveled around with was very very popular, very culturally relevant. I know it broke a few of my family members' hearts to hear that Larry the Cable Guy was actually from Ohio and not from the South, and everything. So it definitely made it culturally relevant to a lot of folks around where I'm from and my family and whatnot. I'm basically all just son. I apologize that I'm gonna try and fix the camera a little bit here in a second. I wanted to ask real quickly if you knew. Um, so I've heard tons of tales about how the word redneck, given this historical context, in this historical context, came about. There's some that are about them wearing their red bandanas to differentiate from the folks that weren't union members. There's stories about them only wearing it when they were at the Battle of Blair Mountain. Um, and it seems to be central. A lot of it seems to be centralized about the Battle of Blair Mountain. And I wanted to know, like,
There's a lot of lore
how,
around
yeah.
Bear Mountain. Yeah, there's a lot
Well, I
of
wanted to
lore
know
and
how
stuff like
often
that.
the term was used before that, and how big of a thing it might have been, and also how much it might have been spread out aside from coal miners, because I know
Yeah,
other folks were using it.
yeah. So the red bandana had been used in over and over and over again actually throughout American unions and strikes, and especially on the radical side. And it especially got picked up a bit with the IWW. So, and the IWW was founded in 1905, but you see the red bandana being used, oh, even a little bit before then amongst striking railroad workers, even timber workers and stuff like that. Uh, but yeah, it was a symbol of solidarity and red, and especially back then, a lot of times, the earliest folks that were looking at that, and the reason for the color red, we're talking about things like the Paris Commune, and a lot of those like French politics were really well read at the time in the United States, and especially on the anti-capitalist side of the political spectrum. And so
Right.
you had a lot of folks who were just, it was all anti-robber baron, and anti big boss. Hence all the dump the boss songs and stuff that come out of the era. um and so the color red stood for the blood of the martyrs that came before them in the fight for labor rights and labor struggles. So it specifically symbolized something, and that's why eventually the IWW adopted that color. The American Socialist Party adopted that color. And you see that color in a lot of those kind of revolutionary movements. The color red. So yeah, it goes right along those pathways.
Do you
Um,
reckon that they deliberately chose that color in solidarity with those other movements? Is that something that's a
yeah,
fair assumption? Okay. Okay.
yeah, I do feel like, especially when it comes to wobbly members, especially they knew exactly what that
Right.
color was. People wrote essays about it. You know what I mean? What the color is and why that color. Yeah, especially. Um, you know, and so, the fact is, radical unionists of that time, and there are different factions, of miners, but for the most part, it was just workers against bosses. You know what I mean? It was workers against bosses. A lot of times, you get people wanting to put mine wars and this kind of real controversial history under the bandana of the politics that we play today, and they don't fit. It's a historical. Do you get what I'm saying? Like they want to be like, oh well, so and so were liberals and so were conservatives, and so, but that doesn't. You can't. That's not where people's heads were at that time. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? Like, especially amongst the miners, it was the bosses against the workers. It was capitalists versus anti-capitalists. A lot of the striking workers, especially at Blair Mountain, wanted nationalization of the mines. They wanted the bosses taken out of the mix completely. So
That's a
it was
very
a
radical
completely
idea
different.
right there.
Huh?
That's a very radical idea right there. That's a very
Yeah, I
radical
mean,
idea right
and
there.
yeah, nationalization of where railroads, or like now the current topic is always talking about nationalization of our medical care. Though there's always been pushback in the United States for those kind of policies, and especially when it comes to unseating very, very rich people. You know what I mean? Of
Hmm.
course, of
Yeah,
course, I'm not going to go along with that.
yeah, yeah. Yeah,
you know,
I know. What's up, Web? Sorry.
well, that the time period that I like when we're discussing this, when we talk about specifically about like the West Virginia mine wars, I don't want to just focus on Blair Mountain, although Blair Mountain, of course, that was the pinnacle of the whole affair.
Hmm.
But it
What
really started in like 1912 or so, like
1912?
much, or
Okay.
the whole conflict. It was a whole thing for well over a decade.
Someone says the working class and the employing class have nothing in common. I think something they have in common is that everything they use is developed by the working class. I think that's something they have in
All
common.
right.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, that whole that whole era started with the Paint Creek Cabot Creek strike, and that would be like 1912. And that was, a bunch of miners. They were striking for the right to unionize itself, and for fair wages. And that's when the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency started kind of coming onto the scene. And they were kind of the hired gun for the coal towns at the time. Um,
Okay. And that's the
so
very early 1900s. That
we're talking like 1912 is when the Paint Creek strike started.
okay, okay.
I'm pro union. Troy Newberry's asking if folks are pro union or anti union.
I am pro union for sure. It'd be a little ridiculous not to be.
So at this point, the UMWA come into play. Hey, that's awesome, Logar. But at this point, the UNW kind of came into play in like Mingo County, West Virginia. And the Baldwin Felts agents kind of came through, and they were just like evicting anybody who they thought was an organizer, this and that. And there was a ton of like cat and mouse politics here. You know what I mean? Like they would send spies onto each other's side. They would do all sorts of kind of real nasty stuff to folks. When they would evict families and things from their camps, from the mining camps, they would create colonies and tent colonies and stuff like up the tracks and stuff like little hobo jungles, so to
Okay.
speak.
Oh,
Um,
okay. Well,
right,
actually,
and
I
actually,
wanted to
what?
ask if if they're working in company towns and you're talking about them getting evicted, that would mean they'd have to like uproot everything. They can't just like find somewhere else within their community to live. They'd have
No,
to
the
uproot
whole
everything and
town
go.
belongs to the company. Yeah, and that's the
Right.
thing. So if you lost your job, you lost your place to live, you lost, your everything. Everything was gone. Everything. So, and they very often in those areas they own the law, i.e. the Baldwin Filtz Detective Agency. And so they would
Right.
come out, yeah, and they weren't paid in dollars either. You were paid in company script. And that made it so that you couldn't spend your money anywhere else. And you would get in trouble sometimes even if you did attempt to go shopping off of company property. Sometimes they'd have people follow you depending on what you were. There's all sorts of wild stories about that kind of stuff. You
Hmm.
had stories about they were mad, people growing their own vegetables. They wanted you to buy them from the store. They would rip up people's gardens. I mean, all sorts of little nasty, nasty little things. I mean, like they controlled
Yeah.
every little bit of stuff. Okay, man, I will put together a reading list and post it. I need to figure out a good venue to do that. I have a link tree where I have one reading list. I can add to that.
um. On conversations before we were have this live stream, you're talking about, and a while back, I've been meaning to try to get it, but you were talking about the book White Trash. I forget the name of the author. Is it Anna Eisenberg or Annie?
Nancy Eisenberg. Yeah, the book is called
There it is.
White Trash, and it is the history of poor white people. And it is an amazing book, and I have read I have also listened to a bunch of talks with her, and she and it does go to show like that book it does go to show how extremely different like white history from black history is, especially during
Mhm.
specific time periods, and how important it is to teach both. You know what I mean? Because otherwise you can't get a clear picture. um
Mhm.
so yeah, no, it's an amazing book. And it does go through so many of the slurs, and especially in the Appalachian region, and different ways that we looked and justified the terrible things that we've done to the poor people in those regions. uh
Mhm.
it's yeah, I suggest reading that one if you're interested in that kind of stuff.
List where y'all live. We live in a van.
I'm in Kansas right now.
Hmm. Hmm. I live in a van and I travel from place to place. That is none of this, by the way, I was ever taught in school whatsoever. Period. None of this. It like I think we probably did a few things about like I heard a little bit about the the coal mine wars and whatnot, but I'm almost certain that the rednecks were demonized. I'm not even sure if they would have used the term redneck. Um, Probably something else to put a little, probably used a different term to put a little bit more fear in our hearts and whatnot when talked about this. But I don't remember
There's
reading about this
always
ever.
been a concerted effort to kind of bury the history of Blair Mountain and the mine wars. That's always, I mean, it took almost 50 years for like that area at all to even recognize it as the largest labor uprising in American history, which it was. It was the largest labor uprising in American history.
Hmm.
And
That
and
should be really relevant then.
well, there even there was a big coal company, and that was at one point trying to like remove the entire battlefield and mine right where the battlefield was, while there was bunch of folks wanting to save the battlefield for historical purposes, and it was a huge tug and pull for a while. The battlefield was there, luckily, which is good. But yeah, it was a burying this history has been something that's been a concerted effort. Like, even folks who grew up in that area will tell you, you know, they had folks that would go in for certain generations from the coal companies talking about coal and this and that to schools, you know, kind of framing coal as this like benefactor, this thing that gives to the community. This is almost as if you wouldn't even, you know, you wouldn't be here if we weren't here, kind of thing. You know, you need us. You know, that's always been kind of that kind of propaganda, I guess. But you know, the history itself is extremely bloody. You know, thousands of people were, you know, arrested, jailed, unalived. You know, there were court cases that spread out for years following. You know, for all sorts of different things. There is also, you know, because there was so much, so many folks being pulled in after, like, Blair Mountain and after everything had died down for, you know, speaking in front of the House, even, other court cases, so on and so forth. There was a real concerted effort from even the miners to keep everything hush hush, to not talk about what other unionists had or had not done during the war, because they were scared of being tried for it. And so there was like an air of secrecy. A lot of those folks left town. You know what I mean, after the fact. So
Well, I'm
yeah,
sure
there was a huge hush hush, you know, even amongst the miners themselves, not just the coal companies.
yeah, I'm sure that the leaders of strikes, and then when it broke out into a war, I'm sure the leaders of that, if they didn't pass away, were harassed for probably a while,
Yeah,
like
many
either
were
through
jailed.
litigation or just their families probably were harassed too. Like, it was probably awful. Um, yeah, that's terrible.
Yeah, so a lot when we talk about how bloody this is and how bad this is, I want you to realize that during this time period, they were literally dropping explosives on mining camps from airplanes.
Really?
They,
Okay.
yes, yes. And you know, we amongst the miners too, you had a lot of, you know, World War One veterans. You know what I mean? And so you had, and amongst the folks fighting the miners, you know, so the war had just ended. You know, our soldiers were home. We had, you know, during Blair Mountain, um, you know, and so it was, you know, just it was a literal battle, like an interior civil war. It was straight up an interior civil war, military tactics, the whole nine yards.
Hmm.
Pretty early on, there was an incident. Let me double check my date. The Holly Grove incident. So the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency had built. It was 1913. Okay, I was right. It was early. 1913. There was this miners' camp named Holly Grove, and they had been going through at Paint Creek and kicking out all, you know, as many unionists and things as they could, and putting them off to, you know, and you know, they had to make their camp, and they called the camp Holly Grove, right? And it's up the tracks of ways.
Holy
And
Grove.
the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency got a private donor to donate and help them build this train that was referred to as the Bull Moose Special. The Bull Moose, no, just so we can make this clear, and this is why you cannot, and I get frustrated with people when they try to push this, all liberals were all rednecks were liberal, all rednecks were conservative thing. So, no, stop. Okay, so the Bull Moose was the name of the Progressive Party at the time, like on the ballot, like Theodore Roosevelt's party. It was the Bull Moose Party. It was all pushing very progressive policies and so on and so forth. And they were the Bull Moose Party. The Bull Moose Special, named after but not bought for by that party, but they never denounced, never sought it down. You had a lot of party members puffing their chests out about the Bull Moose Special train, but this was an armored freight train with machine gun like lining the top of it and out the windows, full of little mercenaries going down the tracks, and they're just like shooting lead into tents as they're going down the tracks. And they did this to Holly Grove, which was one of these little camps that was set up. And when we're talking camps, we're not just talking about a bunch of miners. We're talking about their wives, their children. These were neighborhoods. These were neighborhoods. You got to think of them about like that. They were like neighborhoods. Children, grandma, grandpa.
And they did that because they were striking?
Yeah, they were trying to get them to clear out away from the mines, because what would happen is that you would still have folks trying to sneak, the unionists and stuff like that, and they would use these different. This was like it was like war, And when I say cat and mouse, is they would sneak supplies into miners that were striking at the areas, like food and stuff, because you couldn't get it from the company store anymore. So they would use these camps and so on and so forth to try to, funnel information, food supplies, medical gear, guns. Sorry, this app. They're gonna.
Yeah.
But you get what I'm saying though. And this is kind of cool. You would have folks like hobo couriers at the time. So we have a lot of those folks who are miners. A lot of folks would have spent time on the rails too, And so when a lot of them were evicted, they were pretty much hitting the rails, and they would use the rails and those kind of pathways and their knowledge of traveling on foot to get those supplies and things like that. And in fact, a way to distribute some flyers and stuff is like you hear about hobos in general, through these different strikes across the country, using something called a mimeograph, which was like a little bit like a portable photocopier. You could fit one in like a slightly oversized briefcase, or like a suitcase kind of thing. And it was portable, and you could make flyers literally in a hobo jungle or in a boxcar. And for those who, we used them, like some people might remember this, like if you're older from school and stuff, there's a real strong smell to the ink, because, we were using them in schools in America for a very long time to make photocopies. But yeah, it's called a mimeograph, which is kind of a cool thing. So you hear about couriers. Huh?
I wonder if I could get my hands on one nowadays.
You probably can. You can probably find an older one and a new one. I bet you can still find them new. People still manufacturing them. The ink does smell. It smells like this weird alcohol smell. Either you hate it or you feel like it's nostalgic. Depending on when you grew up. If you grew up around it, you might find it kind of comforting because you remember it from school.
Well, I don't remember any of
it?
those being around, but maybe if I smelt it, I might remember. But that's crazy not only is that terrible about the bull moose train and them being treated that way and getting evicted, all of that is terrible. But I'm also thinking of like the conviction of these people to keep fighting for themselves and organizing and striking, and the just the strength that that probably took was insane. I don't see that too much around anymore. I suppose it might still be around, but I don't see it and I don't hear about it at least.
Yeah. So they used that train, the Bull Moose Special, throughout, up until the Battle of Blair Mountain. Like, no, like the government never stopped them from machine pewing its own citizens, unfortunately. And one of the things that a lot of people bring up too are this escalation, though. Like, how did it get so bad? Like, how did this happen? How did it escalate so far? And a lot of this cat and mouse that was happening, a lot of people talk about Sid Hatfield. And they mentioned the movie Matewan. And Matewan was like, you're talking about this sheriff that was standing up for the striking miners in this particular area, and eventually he gets unalived on the steps of the courthouse. And this, he ended up becoming a martyr of the movement. And this really, really kind of got sparks flying. This was definitely like a linchpin moment in the whole ordeal.
That's Sid Hatfield, you said?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, totally worth going back and kind of watching. I'm gonna put together a reading list, and I'll put links to some movies and stuff on there too.
Yeah. Okay.
But the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency was pretty much on the hook for that. Like it was their guys who were doing all the unaliving for the most part.
Oh, well, now I got dogs going real quick. Well, okay. Everybody settle. All right. I wanted to know the Baldwin Felts Agency, detective agency. Does that have any connection to the Pinkertons? Is that like that? Did they fill the same role as Pinkertons would?
Filled the same role.
Okay.
They did not have a connection. So, I mean, it was the same kind of thing. There were a couple of these kind of detective agencies. Baldwin Felts was very popular at the time amongst a lot of these big bosses of these towns, even like in Colorado and stuff, when you talk about Ludlow. And in fact, in Ludlow, Baldwin Felts, instead of the train, the Bull Moose Special in Ludlow, Colorado, they had something called the Death Special, and it was an armored vehicle, the same thing with all the stuff hooked up to it, just ready to plow through Union camps. Yeah, you hear that stuff and you're like, oh my gosh, like we were doing this to our citizens.
Yeah, that's and some of that was either funded by like mega capitalists or the U.S. itself, right?
Yeah,
At the time?
I'm not. I don't know of any other historical time where somebody has built something like that and brought them through at their own citizens before. I bet. I mean, I've not really actively looked overseas, but now I'm going to. Now that you mentioned that, I'm like, are we the only ones that have done that?
Yeah, that's
That's pretty
ridiculous.
hardcore, though. It's pretty hardcore, and we can bring up the Ludlow thing some other time. Um, but because that deserves a whole nother talk in and of itself. That was a whole ordeal. Um, and and yeah, it deserves some attention too. So,
Okay.
but a lot of people don't ever learn about union history or labor history, and both political parties in the United States do actively do things to pull that kind of history out of schools. Both political parties do,
Yeah.
which is unfortunate. Um, so if so parents, if I would suggest taking the time to teach this to your kids if you know any of it, or if you have a friend that knows it, maybe have your friend come over and talk to your kids once in a while about this kind of stuff, because it's important stuff to learn. um and I've been kind of poking at and putting together some homeschool materials and stuff. I thought that might be fun, at least about the history of the American hobo and some other subjects like that. But
If you can keep talking to the chat, and I'll be listening. If you can wait for just a second, I'm gonna move really quick, see if I can get a little bit of a better spot. The sun is directly on my phone, and my phone is heating
sure,
up, so I'm gonna move real quick, but I'll still be listening.
yeah, sure. Yeah, so I'm having fun doing history, and I hope y'all are too. And if you do have any ideas about other parts of labor history, labor history is what I poke at all the time. But if y'all have any other ideas about other subjects in the labor history umbrella that you'd like to talk about, let me know in the comments, and maybe we can do that. I'm gonna upload this later on the other platform, the red play button. So if you are just getting in or missed some of this, then you can go back and find it on the red play button. I'll be posting it tomorrow in the morning there. So if you missed it, you can go there and watch it. And there's some other talks that are there about the random labor history and history of the American hobo that are there. Oh yeah, sure.
That's where we've been digging. Digging a trench around the house to get rodents out of there. Apparently, it's a very effective method to do that.
Well, that's cool.
Yeah, it's been
Hey,
some
Clint.
hard labor.
Denny.
Speaking of labor history, I'm making it right there.
Denny. Yeah, so sorry, my dog is very loud.
It's all right. We got loud dogs over here too. They're just not as close.
My dog is in charge.
Yeah, is that Denny out there?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, so when we talk about labor history, usually we just kind of talk about the very little bit that we kind of brush over in schools. We don't talk about the actual ins and outs of things. That's why we learn about people, but we don't necessarily talk about like what they stood for in life very often. Like examples of that would be folks like Helen Keller or Albert Einstein or Charlie Chaplin. You know what I mean? Those are all good examples of that. We learn about Helen Keller's disability. We don't learn that she was a union organizer for the IWW,
Mm-hmm.
as an example.
Yeah.
So
I said Martin Luther King. I think he's definitely one of history's misunderstood people.
very much so.
You know,
Yes, very
how do
much
you
so.
how do you think I mean, I guess it's just the same old story of how we forgot all of that kind of history. It's just it gets slowly taken out. It doesn't get passed around enough. Gets taken out of our schools and everything. I was gonna ask if you have any like personal thoughts on exactly how the term redneck got plagiarized, how it got so manipulated.
How it got taken out of the vernacular
Uh huh.
or changed, like the
Mm-hmm.
context changed. A lot of it goes with, again, it's just not teaching that history, not people not understanding where that actually came from.
Mm-hmm.
Because to me, when somebody says redneck, because I spent so much time like in this space studying like labor this, labor that, especially within the last like five, like half decade or so. Um, like for me, when somebody says redneck, I immediately think, okay, you want to, uh, I think leftist. You
Yeah,
know what I
yeah.
mean? Like
On
immediately,
rise and strike,
because
yeah,
like
working.
historically
Yeah.
they're anti-capitalist,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, it kind of got switched in the vernacular. Going up through the civil rights era really is when you start to see it kind of switch. Um, it didn't take long for the American, memory to collectively start forgetting about Blair Mountain. It didn't take long at all. It took only like a generation, maybe two.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm sure because the word redneck not just got washed of its history, but got replaced in a kind of dehumanizing way. I've been called, especially out here on the wild west of the internet, I've been called a hillbilly, a redneck, and all these different terms that are supposed to be an insult. Of course, I take them very kindly. I appreciate when people call me that, whether no matter their intention. I appreciate that, but it got replaced by people that are supposed to be dumb, and it's not all negative connotations. There's like it might sound bad, but the simplicity of some folks that I got raised around um, um, is a nice feature to some folks, you know.
Yeah.
Um, and I've heard the term over and over, and I use it in my day to day life redneck ingenuity, being able to hook up things that aren't maybe supposed to be hooked up a certain way, but it runs.
I mean,
That's
that's
my
something that Jeff
entirety.
Foxworthy did do, though. Is he took that
Mhm.
because for a while, like during the civil rights era and like going on like up until up until round about when Jeff Foxworthy came on the deal, um, the phrase redneck had started morphing back into this, you're rural, you're uneducated, you're awkward, you're backwards, you're hill folk, you're
Right.
you know, you're those people, you know what I mean? And then Jeff Foxworthy came around and it started becoming this new identity. And that was like in the 90s. That's when you saw more and more people like using the phrase as like a badge of honor. You know what I mean? You start seeing redneck and, like people like cheering it on, belt buckles that say it, t-shirts that say it, you know what I mean? Like cheering it on, using it as, yeah, like a badge of honor.
I,
That word is definitely morphed in some weird ways.
yeah, I kind of there might be some missing historical context, and please enlighten me if there is, but I do kind of despise the association that like I see belt buckles like when I go to visit my mom in Georgia, at the flea market. I see belt buckles with redneck on it all the time, and that's awesome. And I want a big belt buckle that says redneck. I think that's really cool, but it's got the Confederate flag on it. It's got the rebel flag on it,
Well, see,
and
and that's a miss. Like the word redneck, and if anything, yeah, it has nothing to do with the Confederacy.
yeah,
Nothing. No,
I wouldn't assume it would have. Maybe there's some
no.
crossover there that I wasn't aware of, or something. But I wouldn't assume that it would have anything to do with the Confederacy or rednecks being like late uh, Confederate supporters or something like that. Yeah,
No,
it's.
the rednecks from where we were talking about the rednecks at the time of Blair Mountain and Pink Creek and all that stuff. Those folks, they were pushing leftist policies. They wanted nationalization of the mines. They wanted nationalization of the railroads. They wanted to get rid of the boss. That's what they were pushing for. They
Mhm.
that had nothing to do with like any kind of thing that anybody in the you know what I mean? That's so far removed from each other.
Mhm.
Has nothing to do with anything.
Yeah. It also it just kind of occurred to me, um, kind of how bad things are sometimes, but in today's current age, because they weren't just fighting for. Hold on, the sun is just following me. Um, they weren't just
You look
fighting
like an
for
angel.
like they weren't just fighting for better working conditions. They were fighting to eliminate the structures.
Yeah,
And that's
they
I
they
suppose
wanted
what.
they wanted to solidify the right to unionize.
Mm,
That's one, and that's something that folks have been fighting for. They're still fighting for that, solidifying the right to unionize. They wanted out with the boss. They wanted to get rid of company towns altogether.
mm,
The way that they saw that being a reality was wasn't just unionization, but for collective ownership and nationalization of the mines altogether.
mhm.
That's how they saw their out. Um,
There's a
yeah,
few
and
words that don't calls to mind, but I've been learned a time or two on not saying those words in certain contexts. But yeah, there's a few political labels that I think could be applied to that if people can read that.
well, when you go back and you look at the media of the time, and I'm going to suggest that anybody who doesn't like, if you have the ability to, it costs a little bit of cash, but if you have the ability to and you're interested in this kind of history, grab yourself one of those newspapers.com accounts or one of the other newspaper archive accounts. There are other places that you can go to look up old newspapers, but I really like the search engine that newspaper.com has compared to the other ones, honestly. It's real easy to look up a lot of these old stories for yourself. Remember that it's media and that the people are writing it are biased just like the media today, but it gives you a good idea where people's heads were, what they were calling each other, what were the names that they were using when they were pointing their fingers and shaking them. And all the time you heard from the papers that the folks, that these striking miners, the rednecks, so on and so, they used the word radical. They used the word Bolshevik all the time. They used the word, they were the Reds. They were, you know, socialists. They were puppets of Soviet Russia. They were, you know what I mean? Like it. That's what the media was. They were people to be feared. They were un-American. Was the deal? They were
Mhm.
consistently looked at as un-American for doing what they were doing. Um, and remembering at this time politically, we had other issues going on the main sphere in American politics. Things like anar there's certain things I can't say on this app, like anarchist. They're like, for example, the the Wall Street incident when I can't the bombing of Wall Street. Damn it, I'm just saying.
Yeah, the lip bombing of Wall Street. Yeah.
Well, and and the Palmer raids are going on at this time too, at just the time, right before the Battle of Blair Mountain, the Palmer raids are going on. So there's a lot of fear that's been being drummed up nationally, not just in West Virginia, about um, wobblies, especially the IWW, anybody with a red union card, anybody with a red bandana, anybody who believed or read or signed up or subscribed to any of those newspapers and periodicals, so on and so
Hmm.
forth. So there was just fear all around too. So it was people were really motivated to hurt other people at this time. So when you had things like this big train that's covered in machine and going through, the people that are cheering this on are feeling like they are patriotic. They're saving their country. That's
Yeah.
really what they believed.
Hmm. A way to justify
Very
violence
sad.
against U.S. citizens. Yeah. Yeah.
But that's
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 that's how it reads, and it's so sad to me. Um, to hear it and read those stories and hear it under that light, like how genuinely they believed that hurting innocent families was patriotic.
um. I wanted to ask if you know about these company towns, um, how they were formed, and maybe what people were doing beforehand. Like the folks that inhabited that place, did they maybe get initially excited about the possibility of work being there, or was it kind of like these people that built up these company towns just kind of vacated people and then put them to work? Do you know if how those kind of came about?
Well, when you talk about company towns, a lot of times these would pop up in more remote areas, right? So you would have a need for lumber, and so then there would be a lumber camp showing up, and then the company already owns the land, right? So they're going to go ahead and put up a store. So they're going to go ahead and build you a church. Well, I guess we need somewhere for these workers to live. I guess we better build some houses and so on and so forth. And eventually it becomes a model. You know what I mean? And eventually it has its own currency. And when it comes to mines, so you're talking like mines, labor camps, some railroad area, stuff would end up this way, but they would be in these like remote locations, so that you could do, so that you could do, so you can have more of a stranglehold on this population. It wouldn't work so much if you were just in a suburb. They could just walk to town. It wouldn't be quite
Right.
the same, right?
Yeah.
Um,
That's how it sounds to me. Is having it either people very close to the space or in the space, kind of luring them in with work opportunities, um, and then just capitalize it, doing what they do, capitalizing on that, and making it into a system where they hold all the power over these people that they want to exploit. That about
exactly.
sounds that sounds right. All right.
Yeah, yeah. It was kind of a natural process, in a weird to a unnatural outcome, I guess,
Yeah.
in a weird way. Yeah, and another thing, to keep in mind too is the way that these camps were populated. So again, you're talking about unpopulated areas, right? So how do they get workers out there? Is that they would use labor sharks, and labor sharks would get a cut of that income a lot of times too, and that's another way that they would get over on workers. And labor sharks were essentially like corrupt employment agencies. And in town, like the way that it would work, like in town, in a factory, like in a more populated area, is that they would you would have to buy a job from the labor shark. The labor shark then, they would get a cut of your funds, and then so would the company that they're sending you to. They would take it out of your first paycheck or your first bit of cash or whatever, but they would just fire, rehire, fire, rehire, fire, rehire, so that they pretty much got a bunch of work for free, right?
Mm.
Those same companies are the people that would populate very often those mining camps and stuff like that. That's how you would get one of those jobs. Is you would go to a labor shark very often.
I've heard about labor sharks from you before and how ridiculous that sounds. And putting that together now in my head, I wonder if that's a tiny bit adapted from when I first started working. Come from Northwest Georgia, Dalton, Georgia. It's a carpet mill factory town. It's a I like to refer to it as a ghost town that is very well inhabited. All the not the mines. It's not mines, but factories. All Most of the factories are shut down. Pretty much three corporate entities own that entire town. To a certain extent, not a company town by any means, but you know what I mean. But I was hired through a lot of what do they call them? Agencies that would get you in the door. You didn't work for that company, you worked for this third party company, and they
Yeah,
took a
yeah,
little bit of your wages.
yeah.
And I
We
wonder
we
if that's
have
kind of adapted
versions
from
of
that.
labor sharks today for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there was always a bunch of stuff. Kind
Temp
of.
agency. That's it. Sorry. Yeah. Temp
Oh no,
agencies.
I have to do a puzzle.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, so yeah, like yeah, you're right. The temp services, temp agencies. Um yeah, that's our version of that today. It's not, there's been some laws put in place, a lot of, uh, the IWW was pushing to make it so that employment you weren't allowed to have private employment agencies at all. That was the IWW's stance on that, is that all employment agencies should be done via the government, because you're talking about people who are already out of a job. Nobody should be taking a cut out of that. There shouldn't be a middleman there. That's not something that should be under the capitalist umbrella, is what they believed.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
and I could see that stance.
Yeah, it felt really exploitative when I was younger.
Yes, it is.
The
Yeah,
whole
I've been through
factory.
that too.
Um,
Yeah.
I guess that's just kind of how it is. Ain't much too much changed. Too terribly too much.
No, we some changes in the laws happened during the New Deal with the Fair Labor Standards Act. A bunch of employment agencies via the government opened up at that time, and it kind of took the teeth out of a lot of the bigger shark agencies that were running. There were some new labor standards put down, made it less profitable for them, which was good. But a lot of those protections have been eroded since. And at the time of the Fair Labor Standards Act, there were carve outs that they made for like office employees and professionals and stuff, so that those guys could still get, a swift boot in the shin.
Mm, mm.
Yeah.
I I'm still having a hard time wrapping my head around. If I'm allowed to be a little loose here and get a tiny bit off topic, um, having a hard time wrapping my head around people legitimately supporting uh, things like armored vehicles going into towns, mass unaliving people that are just trying to fight for their rights. I'm having a hard time imagining people do that, but it does remind me of some folks that are doing that to to this day with all the things going on. Let's see. Careful with my words here. I think weaponized is okay to say. Weaponized officers, militantly occupying cities. People being supportive of that. ICE. I'm not sure if I can say that, but people supporting that kind of thing. I kind of see. how that kind of comes together, how that mentality comes together. Well,
Well, um, just like we were talking about before, the media around. Hey, there's anywhere, man. But the media around the miners at the time was pushing the idea that these people were un-American. They used the word, they would act as if and use the words as if they were like an enemy of the people. Um,
right.
that they were insurgents, that they were, and the main thing was anti-American, anti-American, anti-American. So yeah, when folks were doing stuff like sending armored trains through neighborhoods, I mean, because you really have to think about those little camps. I mean, they were neighborhoods. I mean, they're whole families, cooking around campfires and kids playing, between the tents, and they were neighborhoods. Um, if you're okay with sending machine boom pew pews whatever down the
Yeah.
tracks, from an armored vehicle, then because it felt like like the people that were cheering that on, felt that that was patriotic. They genuinely thought that that was patriotic. Um, and folks will folks will jump behind damn near anything if when they feel scared that they're being invaded or taken over or the enemy of their, you know what I mean? Like folks will jump behind a lot, um,
Yeah.
and it
I'm,
sucks.
yeah.
It
I'm sure.
sucks,
I'm
but
sure it's also the story for a lot of other places, but this does seem to be, Rednecks, the Battle of Blair Mountain, all that stuff does seem to be a another story of people trying to do better for themselves, better for their country, stand up for human rights, labor rights, workers' rights, and all that, and just people that want to make a buck. Um, funding a giant campaign to get as many normal people as they can, as many citizens as they can to run this hate train against people that are just trying to stand up for everybody. You know what I mean? It's very unfortunate. And
anywhere
we
man
happen
said
again and again.
anywhere man made a comment. He says people love travelers on social media but support orders to imprison us. Yeah,
Hmm.
I've always found that strange. When people they follow folks from the traveling community, like the van lifers and stuff, that are supporting some of these policies that make it illegal for them to do what they're doing.
Yeah.
It just that seems like so weird. That's the very definition of cognitive dissonance. Yeah.
Yeah, had a lot of people that support me and like what I do because of my music, and then as soon as I talk about something that is negatively impacting either me personally or my community, laws that are being passed to, further criminalize, because it's been been criminalized for a long time, but further criminalize homelessness and sleeping outside and everything. As soon as I open my mouth about that, they're like, no, that's good. That's getting rid of the bad people, not you. It's getting rid of me. It's getting rid of everybody, not just the ones you think are cute on social media. You know what I mean? It's, yeah.
I'm sorry, guys. My bugs are really loud here. I don't know if you heard that cicada that was just like screaming right next to me a second ago. I'm sorry. But
Nah, I
the
didn't
bugs
hear
are
it.
loud here.
The bugs are big out here. I'm
I
up
agree, Jamie.
north in Minnesota, very up north, dang near Canada. That's how you say that word. Um, very close to Canada. It's starting to get cold too, but the bugs are pretty big up here. But it's nice and quiet. tons of woods. It's been great out here.
So, September 12th, or September 1912, is when, the Paint Creek kind of stuff, like martial law, is kind of went down in West Virginia over the Paint Creek strikers. Um, and a lot of strikers at that point were like picked up and tried by like military tribunals and stuff. Like, um, so to put this in perspective, during the entirety of the conflict, you had people being taken in and doing time for striking, um, pretty early on, and there was a lot of violence coming through, on the coal owner side, on the side of the Baldwin Detective Agency. They're doing a lot of harm to the unionists. But the moment the unionists would stand up for themselves, then they'd be put in jail for standing up for themselves. Is kind of, how it ran. So in 1913, Mother Jones created a bunch of like national outrage at the time. Like again, you have to remember, like, these things don't happen in a vacuum. There's a lot of stuff going on nationally in American history at the time. And so, like, right at the beginning of the Paint Creek Massacre, Mother Jones was arrested and then court-martialed and sentenced to like 20 years. And she, at the time, she was in her, I think she was in her 70s at the time. And so there was national outrage. People did, she did not belong in jail. It's Mother Jones. She's everyone's mother. She takes care of the children and the poor miners. It's Mother Jones. So national outrage eventually ended up leading to her release. Yes, there was martial law in the area around the mines and those areas there.
Yeah, I actually wanted to.
Huh?
I wanted to ask. I wanted to ask real quick. How was like? How did police work back then? I know police, as we think of it now, they're everywhere. They're officially a branch of the government and all that stuff. It wasn't always that way. I was gonna ask how police worked back then, and I know they
Well, in
were
this
fighting.
area, you're going to talk about local sheriffs and, and their deputies and people that they deputize. And then you're going to talk about the privately owned, town sheriffs. And you're going to talk about the privately owned detective agencies that the company owners own. So Jamie mentioned the Pinkertons. That's a good example. And Baldwin Felts Detective Agency was the one that was really, really popular, and that ran a lot of this stuff during the time of the mine wars in West Virginia specifically. The Pinkertons were really active during things like the railroad strikes and stuff like that, and especially like right at the turn of the century, the Pinkertons were really on it. Hey, thanks anywhere, man. We're just going for it. Oh, the Molly
So there wasn't
Maguires.
like.
That's a long discussion. The Molly, Jamie, thank you for reminding me of that, because that is a great thing that we should maybe do a talk about, is the Molly Maguires. Um, that's got a lot of mystery around it. Some people think that they did exist, and some people think they did not. So I think that would be a fun one to do. Thank you so much for reminding me of that, Jamie.
Yeah, looking forward to hearing about that.
Yeah, no, that's
But yeah,
great.
so there wasn't like this huge police force in these company towns, or hardly much of anywhere at the time, I'm guessing.
Not in the way that we know them now. Not in that same way. It was mostly like sheriffs and their deputies and stuff. You wouldn't get like a central police force kind of thing until you like went into a larger area. You know what I mean?
Okay.
But out in these areas, these company town areas, a lot of these, this was more rural. You were getting sheriffs and their deputies, the people that they deputized. You're getting the Pinkertons and the Baldwin Felts detectives and the other agencies that are like them, and you're getting some kind of like vigilantes sometimes. Somebody mentioned bounty hunters. Hey, thanks, Care Bear. But somebody mentioned bounty hunters and stuff like that further up in the comments, and that's a good example of that. Kind of vigilante groups coming in and trying to make a little bit of money.
Mm.
Um, so so yeah, it wasn't the police as we know them today. It was more like small town sheriffs.
Okay.
And when we talk about like the Hatfield stuff, a lot of sheriffs would side with the coal folks, the coal companies, and not with their own citizens, and marshals, yeah. Um, not and they would not side on the side of their actual citizens and people. You came to Hatfield stood up for the miners, created an issue, and then Baldwin Felts came in and he was unalived on the courthouse steps eventually.
Oof.
So
But that's not a common occurrence. It was generally the town sheriff would be against the workers as well.
a lot of time he was in cahoots.
Okay.
Or
Okay.
the marshal,
The,
Grandma Faith is commenting Marshall, yeah, Marshall.
it really was like a case of workers versus employers. It's like
Very much so.
workers
That's
versus
why I keep saying when people try to put this in the context of politics today, and they're like, "Oh well, rednecks were liberal or conservative or this and that," and it's like, no, they were neither. They were stop doing that to this history. It doesn't fit in that frame. People try to do that with the pointy hat people as another example. Stop. Don't do that to this history. You just need
yeah.
to learn the history. Um, yeah, so like it's real frustrating to hear people try to continually put American history in a frame of today's politics. It was worker versus boss. It was anti-capitalist versus capitalist. It was about workers, you know? It
Mhm.
wasn't about political parties.
I
I
know
mean,
that
come
that is.
on.
I'm not trying to turn this into drama, but I know there's a specific creator that me and you have both seen that has done that and been on record multiple times
Yeah,
trying to
and
make
it's so frustrating. It's so frustrating.
saying that
Yeah,
rednecks
because
were liberal.
go ahead.
Um, well, I was just gonna say, I mean, if you think about it now, the Liberal Party wouldn't be doing any of that. They would also be getting upset if people were striking en masse like that, and if it was getting to that end, the Liberal Party would not be supporting that. They wouldn't be doing that now. Like it doesn't make any sense. Just like you were saying, it does. The pieces don't
Yeah,
fit right.
it's a historical. It doesn't work. You can't put it in that frame. Yeah, it was workers against boss. It was capital against anti-capital. It wasn't, liberal versus conservative. Yeah, it was labor
Mhm.
versus capital. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, people try to put a lot of American history in those kind of frames, and it just doesn't fit. That and we used those words in a very different ways at the time too. Um, like those words, weren't used in the same kind of context either. So you have to be careful when you try to put those hats on things.
Man labor versus capital. Yeah. Yeah. That sounds about right. Um, I don't. Uh, Again, getting a tiny bit off of topic, but it seems like not very off topic. Because it seems like back then. it was a lot, but there was a lot more organization going on with the working class. It seems like there's a lot more division and this like illusion of the two-party system that keeps everybody kind of get it going in a circle, not getting anywhere with any kind of progress for
That
any
was still
political
a thing
movements.
then. So
Okay.
what else was going on at the time in American history during this time is that you had Eugene Debs on the scene, and Eugene Debs was the last person that we had for run for president in the United States under a socialist ticket, and he ran from prison because he was in prison for giving a speech against World War One. He didn't believe that in the draft or that we should go to World War One, and so he gave a speech against it, and he was put in prison for it. He ran for prison. The last time he ran for prison, he ran out of his prison cell. He ran for president. He ran out of his prison cell.
Okay.
Um, so there's always this tug and pull about like there can't be a third party. You know what I mean? That was part of the discussion even back then. And um, more who you would have considered more progressive um, citizens would poke at the folks pushing behind Eugene Debs and be like, "Oh well, the same kind of stuff you hear today, or you're going to make us lose the election. It's going to be your fault." It's the same kind of stuff. Um,
Okay. Yeah, I was
that's
wondering if I was
not
looking
new.
at
That's
history
not
rose
new at
colored.
all.
Okay. Okay. So there's always kind of been this like ridiculous kind of like two-party, this is the only way society can function. We can't have these other parties that'll change too much kind of thing
Yeah,
going
there's
on.
been a pushback against parties on either side of the aisle. On either side of the aisle, whether somebody wanted to start a new conservative party or a new more left wing party, like it's been like that on both sides of that divide. Um, so I mean that's just something that's true about American politics, which is unfortunate. Um, overall, overall, you know, when we look at American history and history today, I do feel like there's certain things that parts of history that we would not be repeating quite as badly, at least were we to genuinely learn them in school. I do.
Yeah.
Like for example, I feel like if we learned how hard we fought to get to end child labor and what those protections look like and what that looked like, and as examples, like we wouldn't be rolling back those protections now, or at least the fight would look very different.
Hmm.
Um, but we don't really teach what that really entailed. We teach about Mother Jones a little bit, but we kind of teach her as kind of this curiosity. Even the PBS documentary about Mother Jones doesn't really mention any of her politics and what she stood for. It just kind of, they brush over that part of her life, um, which is frustrating and annoying, because I feel like we should be talking about everything so that we can see the big picture.
Hmm.
Um,
I
but
would
it happens on all sides of that spectrum. The inability to learn from our past.
I would personally love to take that word back, the word redneck back. I've seen a few people online, talk about the history of it, and I think that's awesome. I think it's wonderful. I think more people should be doing it. I would love to try and get that word removed from its ahistorical context. Redneck is the word I'm talking about. Um, Same thing with white trash or hillbilly or anything like that. I'd love to take those words back a little bit.
Well,
Jamie said,
I'm going
uh,
to recommend again Nancy Eisenberg's book because I think that's a great place to start if you're wanting to learn about that kind of stuff. But yeah, no, I'm gonna highly recommend that book. And you can find an audiobook of it if some of y'all are into the audiobook stuff. There is an audiobook for it. But yeah.
just thought. this comment was interesting. There was Jamie says there were farmer labor parties at that point too. And then they also said until they got taken over by Brian, Brian from the Democrats. Do you know anything about that? Do you know anything about the like farmer labor parties and whatnot?
They had a bunch of different parties showing up throughout. Have you ever seen that big map? It's like a it's like an antique drawing. I need to pull this thing up and show you, send you a link. But it shows all the different American parties and the ideologies and how they snake through American history, and it looks like this winding snake tree branch curly Q vine thing. You know what I mean? And it shows all the split ups of parties as it's going down. It is a really neat graphic. I need to find a copy of that and send it to you.
I do really want to see
Jamie,
this.
I'm going to put together a little bit of a reading list for this talk. I'm going to put it on my link tree. You're going to be able to find that on my website. My website's spoonlady.com. And so give me till tomorrow. Today is Thursday or Friday. Give me till tomorrow, and I'm gonna see if I find a copy of that map. I'll link it there since we discussed it here. But it's pretty cool. And I'll put up some links to movies, books, other media, anything that we happen to have talked about in this thing. I'll put there. In case anybody wants to look up some stuff. So yeah, I have a reading list there now. I'll update the reading list is there.
I ain't trying to backtrack too much, but I'm not sure how to pronounce your name. I'm sorry if I mispronounce it, but Kerber says redneck to me is born and raised in the South. Question mark as a question. Good people. That's a fair and that's a fair assumption and a fair assumption than a lot of people make about folks being called redneck. Uh, that's probably one of the most positive ways I've seen it put outside of a historical context. But we're actually talking about the history of that word being used. Um,
Yeah, we're talking about its relationship to the mine wars and to labor strikes that came before. Um, yeah.
is it is there a way in your words I'd be interested for you to kind of historically say a what a redneck is, or say what a redneck is historically? Like what? How would you sum that up?
A redneck at the time of the mine wars, and we're talking about 1912 to 1921, and this phrase was used earlier as in this context, was meant a radical miner. And I wanna emphasize the word radical. And what I'm saying here is it meant radical miner because they wanted, not only were they fighting for basics, better pay, better work environment, the right to unionize, they were literally also fighting for the nationalization of the mines themselves. They found that as their way out of these company coal towns. That was the way to get the boss's grip off of them, is how what they felt. So yeah, during that specific time, that is what redneck was referring to. And if you go back, as an example, if you go back through like old newspapers and stuff, that's why you see consistently through the newspapers at the time when they're using the word redneck at the time, and especially centered around miners, they're using the word Bolshevik, red. That's why the color red was chosen. But Bolshevik, red, socialist, anarchist, radical, un-American, It was drilled into people's minds that these were not people to be trusted. These were not people that you should, be teaming up with. These were anti-American, especially. And that's why people were so apt to be gun-ho for people like the Baldwin Felts detective agencies or to cheer on the mining companies, is because of this propaganda that came behind it in this wind that was fueled by things like the Pomerades, like the mass media surrounding people like Eugene Debs and Mother Jones and Big Bill Haywood. Um, the bombing of Wall Street, anarchist mail bombs were happening at the time. These things don't happen in a vacuum. You know what I mean? So we're talking, there's national issues going on that's fueled even further the stuff that was going on at the time of Blair Mountain, Paint Creek, all of that kind of stuff. You know what I mean? So when we're talking about redneck in that context, we're talking about specifically radical miners. And I want to highlight the word radical.
Hmm. Um, LOL, Abby just said like every red flagged word on here in a row, hashtag legend. Yeah, it's super hard to talk about this stuff. It's hard to talk about normal things, honestly, on here with the words that are, you know, you're not supposed to say, I suppose. It's never been really that all that clear whether you can or can't say them, what context you can say them in, but especially talking about this kind of history, history in general of the people, it's really hard to talk about it without saying a lot of those words.
Yeah, so that being said, yeah, this platform does not like my history stuff. So when you do see it, do me a favor and push the buttons and make a comment, because that helps it think that it's okay, and that would be great if it thought it was.
uh, Also, if I'm allowed, I'll say the same thing. Yeah, please do that. Let me just reinforce that point. Please do that. She's doing the Lord's work out here, talk about history and whatnot. Also, if you don't mind doing that when it comes to some of my political stuff or some of my political songs, especially, this app has.
Yeah, do that with any of the messages that you want to get out. Just make it a point to push those buttons on the messages that you want to get out.
This app
Um,
has monetized a lot of the songs that I've had. It has also just outright taken a lot of those songs down. Um, so if you see it, it'd be cool if you'd interact with it because it's hard out here. This app doesn't seem to like me doing anything except for talking about country music drama, and I that gets a little tiring. So I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
all right, we've been on here a while. Do we have any questions from the chat or anything you think that we skipped that we should talk about?
Yeah,
Maybe we should do that before we all get off
I
to
have.
our stuffs to do.
I would love to get some to some chatter questions just real quick because I don't think we gone over it very much. I had a question if you don't mind. Um, Ultimately, in sorts, the Battle of Blair Mountain was lost to the people. Um, what was
Yes.
kind of the aftermath of that? If you just
The
briefly, what was kind of
aftermath.
the aftermath of that, if you don't mind?
Well, eventually, the military was called in, and as we talked about before, um, as we talked about before, uh, a lot of the miners and things like that were in those, like, a lot of them were veterans themselves from World War I. And so when the military came in, you had a lot of folks who absolutely refused to raise arms against their own military and dropped arms when the military came in. They refused to shoot at American soldiers. So yeah, that essentially ended it right there. When that happened, you had court case after court case after court case of folks being pulled in, not only in front of the government. You know, they'd Senate and House hearings about this stuff. Everything, like they especially talked about things like Holly Creek came up, the mine camp that got leaded by, you know, by the bull moose train, came up as an example. So one person that came up, oh, we didn't talk about Mother Blizzard. She got pulled in. So Mother Blizzard is a good thing to talk about. So and her son was a big union organizer, a union boss. But Mother Blizzard took a crew in the middle of February, I think it was 1921, and literally dug up the railroad tracks so that the bull moose train couldn't come down the tracks in the middle of the night, like wrenched them loose and useless. And it made it so that, you know, I mean, they were going to be able to sleep well that night. You know what I mean?
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Um, but yeah, her story is great. And if you take an internet search and look up a picture of her, you want to hang out with her and have coffee. I mean, you want to be her buddy. She looks like everyone's grandma. She just looks like the sweetest old lady. You know, so I'm trying to imagine her like running out and like you know, pushing these younger men, these union men to take their pickaxes and stuff and pull up these rails, you know, and twist them to such a way. That's
Mm.
interesting to me.
Yeah, that's
But
awesome.
yeah, the bull moose couldn't make it down then.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I suppose now would be a good time to open it up to questions. I already got one here, if I may say. Guitar pick says I'm Native American and I don't use redneck. I think it's not nice. So I can't speak for every Southern person, but I am Southern. That's who it generally gets applied to. And we've been talking about the history of, you know, workers in the South in general, and you know, redneck is associated with that. Throughout history, it's been kind of misused and misappropriated. I personally love it when people call me redneck, no matter their intention. I personally love it when people call me redneck. I would say that it is okay in general to call somebody a redneck, especially if you don't mean it in a negative context. I would say that, but I don't speak for every Southern person.
Yeah,
Just
I
wanted
don't
to
want to
say
lose
that
that
myself.
history myself, as far
Hmm.
as like in the context that we're using it here.
Hmm.
Somebody asked, was Emma Goldman involved in any of this? Emma Goldman was involved in a little bit in the Ludlow incident and stuff, but there's no record of her ever actually setting foot around the West Virginia mine wars. She did write about and denounce like coal companies and stuff like that, and she did write in support of those unions. She did talk about them in her speeches, but she was not directly involved. She, at the time, she was more pushing on free speech, birth control, women's rights, those kind of avenues at that moment. Um, so yeah, she was a huge voice at the time, and she did get people riled up, and she did spread the message, but she wasn't directly involved. Yep, yeah.
How did Woody Guthrie and folk music factor into all of this labor stuff in quotes, all of this labor stuff? Somebody asked.
Woody Guthrie came later. He came later. Woody Guthrie was talking more about the Great Depression era. He was learning his labor history from the old unionists and stuff, you know, and so that's where a lot of the history and his idols were, you know, and so if you want to put that into context there, um, so Yeah, yeah, the old labor heads, the old school history folks, and then you had like the beatniks coming through, and then you had the new left, and so on and so forth. Every generation blamed the other generation for something, and vice versa, just like how it always is with every movement. But for the most part, he played a very great role in perpetuating those songs, because he re-sang and brought back to life a lot of those old Union songs at that time. Kind of revamped them, and when people found him, they found him to be inspiring, and that's part of the whole telephone game of keeping the history going, and he played a crucial role in that, for sure. Was the Bolshevik
Um,
Revolution aimed at elevating the working class, and how was it used as a fear tactic here? Okay, okay. This is a great question, actually. So this is Anywhere Man asking. So at the time, okay, there's a movie I'm going to recommend here, and it's actually a Hollywood movie. Then there's not a lot of Hollywood movies that have to do with these kind of subjects, but it's called Reds, and Warren Beatty and Jack Nicholson are in it, and it's really good, and it's got all these little tiny little clippets between like scenes in the movies where it's got like these elderly folks from that time period talking about um socialism and the Bolshevik Revolution and what it felt like. The whole movie is about this feller named Jack Reed, who is one of the only Americans who went over and saw the Bolshevik Revolution from the inside, and he wrote a book about it called 10 Days That Shook the World, which is another book that I recommend. At the time of the Russian Revolution, though, you have to remember that America was in a robber baron phase. People were extremely poor in America. And so they looked at, you had a good faction of people who were looking at the Russian Revolution as something hopeful, because they saw the working class actually grabbing the reins of things. Now, whether or not history proves true or not is not what we are discussing here. Okay, that is for something further down the road. Thank you, Carol. But at the time of the revolution itself, and at the beginning of the revolution, the things that the Bolsheviks were pushing were rights for women. Women had the right to vote, ending child labor. They were pushing for a lot of things that unionists in the states were pushing for. And so they found it very, very inspiring. And this scared the holy crap out of capitalists in the United States, and especially of the robber barons. And so, of course, full force, the media pushing back on this narrative and using the word Bolshevik as an objective to mean, to mean evil, to mean, that you wanted to take down Americans, that you wanted to do this, like you were a subversive, you were an enemy of the state. That anything that was on that side of the political spectrum, that you were a Bolshevik. They tied you that it was something foreign, not American. Everything that these people were doing, it was a foreign. It's all foreign agitators, not American. They sometimes they would even use the words invaders, and these people are invading. That's You got a lot of the anti-immigrant sentiment coming out of that. That's why you had the folks like the pointy hat people absolutely hated migrants and immigrants, hated them, and they looked at them as part of this Bolshevik force coming to the states. And they were one of the reactionary groups that was used to fight unions at the time. So of course there was Red Scare around the Bolshevik Revolution at the time. That was part of the fuel used to make people scared of radical unionists. Very, very much so. That's why they called the unionists Bolsheviks all the time, even though it was not an accurate descriptor. Um, uh, hopefully,
that's
hopefully that answers the question.
Somebody says F the pointy hat people. For sure. I grew up seeing that. Not very, very commonly, but I grew up seeing some pointy hat folks. In fact, some of my family that I am disassociated with were members of that. And yes, in as strongly as I can put it, F the pointy hat people for sure. Uh, Throughout history and now, F the pointy hat people. um, well, Madeline was here. I don't know if it'd be proper for me to shout out Madeline. I was hoping she could pop up on stream and say hey for a second. But yeah, Madeline, Railcar Rosie Art. Check her out if y'all are down for doing that. She's a watercolor painter. My phone is at 10%.
We've been
yeah,
on here a while.
Yeah.
For anybody who hopped in on this stream midstream and want to hear the beginning of the stream, tomorrow in the afternoon I'm going to put this up on the red play button, so you can watch it there. Lisa Sandarts wants you to check out her art too. And Anywhere Man here, he's in our chat. He's a buddy of ours. We've done some history talks with him. Give him a follow if you're into that kind of cool stuff. If you're into learning about traveling and you like the traveling culture and things like that. Want to follow him around because he's fun. He's going on adventures.
Yeah, I'm hoping he's pretty close to me, and I'm hoping we can meet up and kick it for a little bit. I've been going places and overstaying my welcome for a while now, but I do travel as well, so it's kind of hard to be in the same vicinity as some of my good friends. So it's always nice to meet up with them and whatnot.
Yeah. All right. I guess maybe I should let you go.
All right,
folks, we're gonna be make sure to follow Les on all the places, even where the music is streaming. Make sure to follow him all those places, especially since we don't know what's going to be going on with this platform. Make sure to do that for all the creators that you're that you're into. Make sure you do that for all of them. Just a little bit of a public service announcement. Make sure to do that. I'm going to, and with the fact that it is hard to talk about history subjects on this platform, we're going to be putting stuff up on other platforms. So be on the lookout for that. And I'm going to be putting up a reading list, so link in the bio if you're watching this on the other platform, so or link in the description, and that reading list will be up tomorrow afternoon when I post this on the red play button. So
yeah, oh yeah, lesblackwell.com or bandcamp.com. Yeah, I got music on Bandcamp if y'all feel like checking that out. Yeah, I appreciate you, Abby. Thank you so much. I always learn something every time I talk to you. I appreciate
this was
these.
a fun talk, huh?
Yeah. I'm looking forward to doing it again when we can. I'm
yeah.
also.
What do you want to talk about next time? Do you know yet?
I don't know yet. I definitely want to. We're both musicians. It definitely would be cool to talk about music at some point, like protest song history of protest songs and whatnot.
We can do the Little Red Songbook.
Yeah. I'd love that. I'd absolutely love that.
Talk about the history of the Little Red Songbook. That would be a great one.
Yeah. Let's do that. But
you got to bring your banjo for that one, though.
Oh, I will. I had it next to me just in case.
Right.
But I think I'm gonna get to digging out here, and then find myself some dinner.
Awesome. I think I'm gonna do the same. I'll talk to you later.
All right. See you around. Thank y'all so much. See y'all.